Well, thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English today because I figured if I spoke in Spanish, then the translator wouldn't know if translating it to Portuguese or to English. So let's just make it simple. It's interesting to me that the three speakers had different interpretation of the session. So I had a different interpretation of the session, and I thought that my talk was about surveillance in an outbreak setting in the United States. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And with American experience, I thought, okay, well, they want an American citizen to talk about American outbreaks. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, my experience, even though I am originally from Peru. My disclaimers. When I finished fellowship in infectious diseases, I went to Northwest Indiana over here to do private practice. And I will cover many different hospitals in Northwest Indiana. So I will drive from here all the way to here, looking at the epidemiology of gram-negative resistance. So in December 2007, Dr. Paul Schreckenberger, who now is deceased, unfortunately, at Loyola Medical Center discovered a KPC-producing Klebsiella pneumonia. That was actually, that patient was transferred from Northwest Indiana. Back then, and I think they continue doing this, but all the microbiologists of Chicago, in the Chicago area, will get together once a month to talk about their interesting cases. And what Dr. Schreckenberger did is he told them, hey, I've seen this KPC isolate. Watch out for them. So a few months later, in May 2008, Dr. Mary Hayden at Rush University detected a patient that looked like a KPC producer, that looked like he had a KPC producer. It was actually a blood culture that turned positive in a patient that was transferred from one of my hospitals to Rush. And upon admission to Rush, the patient was detected to be positive. So I actually got an email from Mary Hayden asking me, Silvia, are you having a problem with KPC producing gram-negatives in your area? So what we did is we took a look retrospectively at all the cases, at all the isolates that had been isolated in our region. And we started to see this. So that patient, in December 30th, 2007, actually came from, and I don't have it here, he came from Northwest Indiana. Later on, January 13, we had another case that was also connected to Northwest Indiana, another case in one of my hospitals, January 29, then April 21, April 27, May 6, May 9th, the case that Mary Hayden called me about. So we started seeing a cluster of cases in this particular hospital. Now, this hospital was an LTAC. I don't know if you're familiar with an LTAC, but an LTAC means long-term acute care hospital. It's not a nursing home. It's a center that was created by Medicare and Medicaid in the United States in order to transfer patients from the ICU that were still being weaned off the ventilators, but were not, even though they were acute, not new things were happening with them. They needed to be weaned off from the ventilator. They needed to have management of chronic wounds, usually large acute ulcers. So they were transferred to these LTACs, and not just from one place, but from multiple places. And they had to have a median length of stay of 21, 25 days in that institution. So if you look at the distribution of LTACs in this area, you see there are a few in the Chicago area, and there were 3 in Northwest Indiana. These are the nursing homes back then. And these are all the healthcare facilities in the area. So what we were starting to see is that patients from the acute care facilities were transferred to LTACs as an intermediary step. And then once they were less acute, they were transferred to nursing homes. Doing something like this. So acute care hospitals sending their patients to different LTACs. The LTACs will keep the patients for 25 days. And then these patients will be discharged either to nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities, rehabilitation centers, homes. But then when they needed to be readmitted, they wouldn't be readmitted back to the original hospital, but in Chicago, but rather to other hospitals in the Northwest Indiana area where I was working. When we did the epidemiological curve of cases at the LTAC, we see here the dark shade actually corresponds to patients that were positive upon admission. And these ones, the light pink, are patients that became positive a couple of days after admission. So we think that horizontal transmission started occurring probably a couple of months before we got a call from Mary Hayden. So this is what we put in place, this bundle of interventions, and these, one of the interventions that were part of the bundle was surveillance cultures. Therefore, I'm talking about this here. So the bundle had different components. And the components were designed based on the transmission of resistant organisms from patients that are colonized to patients that are not colonized. There are three main pathways, right? One pathway is the contaminated healthcare workers' hands. The other pathway is contaminated equipment. And the other pathway is through contaminated surfaces, right? The environment. So the daily 2% chlorhexidine applications was done in order to decrease that fecal patina, the bioburden of bacteria in the skin of patients, so that it will decrease the contamination of the hands of healthcare workers and decrease the contamination of the environment. Environmental cleaning, point prevalence surveillances, and I'm going to show you the results, education and isolation precautions. So these are the point prevalence surveillances that we did in this facility. You see that initially the percentage of positivity in this facility was 20%. So out of 39 patients in the LTAC, 20% were positive using rectal swabs. This went down to 12%, then 5%, 3%, and then 0. And it stayed at 0 for the next couple of months. So this was my experience in that particular LTAC. But what about the regional experience with this particular outbreak? So Mary Hayden's group published the network of the social network of these resistant organisms. Here's the epidemic curve. You see here, these are the patients located in the LTAC. The dark colors are patients that had an unknown origin of their KPC-producing organisms, and the other ones are nursing home related. So you see LTAC, 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 and these are all from my LTAC. So we developed social network analysis in 3 phases of the outbreak. This is the early phase, this is the LTAC, and these are nursing home facilities primarily. Nursing homes are in green, the LTAC is in red, acute care hospitals are in yellow. So you see that the LTAC was playing not that great of a role here, giving patients away. So when you see these arrows, the arrow means that the organism is going from one facility, and the arrow points to the facility that is accepting that patient that is already positive for KPC. Take a look at this one. This one was in the middle of the outbreak in my LTAC. So here's the LTAC, and here are all the patients that are being discharged from the LTAC to other facilities already positive. You see these arrows are pointing out to other facilities. Here, 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 here. And the facilities, well, these are the case patients, but these are the other facilities: nursing homes, nursing home, nursing home. And you see this later portion of the regional outbreak in which the number of cases goes down. This is after the implementation of the bundle of interventions at my LTAC. The number of patients goes down, and you see that the number of patients that the LTAC is associated with goes down dramatically. And you see there the impact of control on the epicenter, of the control of the outbreak in an epicenter, the regional impact of that control. And you see more activity in the nursing homes of the area. This is the aggregate of those three phases. Okay, so these are other personal experiences I've had with surveillances. After 5 years of being in Northwest Indiana, I moved to Miami, and they were having an outbreak with KPC producing plebs. One of the key, from my perspective, one of the key interventions of this bundle was the identification of asymptomatic carriers. That's what we started doing here with point prevalence surveillances. We identified 3 patients that were positive on surveillances. We isolated them, we cohorted all the positives, the outbreak stopped. This is a summary of why we do what we do, right? Positive patient, negative patient, 3 main pathways, and these are the infection control interventions. No rocket science. What is more challenging is not designing the intervention, the bundle. What is the most challenging thing in our field is having people comply with the interventions. That's where the challenge exists. This is the experience, one of the other experiences in Miami, where we had a couple of decades of an outbreak with Acinetobacter. It was endemic, it was in the environment. At some point, we had so many patients with Acinetobacter that the patients that were isolated were the negative patients. And I'm sure that you can relate to that situation. These are 2 units, the medical ICU and trauma ICU. And you see how we use a cohorting unit to put all the patients that were identified on surveillances or in clinical cultures together. And actually, we gave these maps not just with the location of the positive patients, but also the location of the positive cultures of the environment. The problem managing outbreaks and convincing people to do the right thing is that we are unable to see organisms. So the goal of these maps was to make organisms, the contamination of the environment, more tangible to people, right? It was more graphic. The organism was present in the bedside table on Tuesday, October 3rd at 2 p.m. This table was contaminated with Acinetobacter. It stops being an abstract concept of environmental contamination and becomes more tangible. And this figure basically tells you that we finally controlled the outbreak in that particular institution when people took it upon themselves to be compliant with the bundle. Outbreak response, the control of an outbreak actually happens when people do what they should be doing. That's the challenge. This is a more recent outbreak this is an experience that I'm currently living. Actually, this happened a year ago, and it's under its second revision. We're doing some final tweaks. In the transplant ICU, we had several cases with KPC producing Klebsiella and Enterobacter. We cohorted the patients to a size of the unit. We cohorted the nurses. We increased environmental cleaning. We put them on contact precautions. We started using booties. We exchanged the drains of the sinks. What is it that we didn't do? It did not work. There are many reasons why I think it didn't work, one of them being the layout of the unit being so small. It was one of the smallest ICUs where this happened, and the patients were solid organ transplant patients. So a combination of things. So we ended up taking out these patients into a cohorting unit. See, this is the index case, and all the other cases were found by surveillance cultures of rectal swabs. And you see that transmission was happening. Once we got to 4 patients, I convinced the administration to pull everybody into a cohorting unit. The transmission stopped. And then the hospital decided that they were done with a cohorting unit, that they couldn't afford to keep a unit open just for these patients. They sent the patients back into the other units, and then the transmission continued again. The reviewers asked us to type all these different isolates. That's what we're doing right now. I can tell you, though, that these are the same PFGEs as this one. The next step is going to be to do whole genome sequencing on these isolates, and that's why we're waiting before we send the manuscript back. When we started doing the cohorting in the specialty unit again, the outbreak has stopped, and it's gone now. It didn't come back. So that was something I lived last year. Right now, what I'm experiencing is an outbreak of an OXA72 Acinetobacter outbreak in Wisconsin, which usually doesn't have Acinetobacter, so that's kind of exotic. The patients that are positive seem to be coming from LTACs, which is my area of expertise. We're trying to determine the extent of the regional outbreak. Maybe I'll get Dr. Grundmann a call in the next few months once I have the typing and the whole genome sequencing on all these isolates. Let me just finish my talk by telling you that now we do surveillance for resistant organisms. I think the future of infection control, at least from our perspective, will be to go a few steps earlier in the biological progression of the disease. If you think about it, not everybody that is exposed to resistant organisms actually becomes colonized and develops an infection. There's a biological progression, right? So we have the healthy host. Something happens, and that healthy host becomes unhealthy, right? And becomes colonized. And then this patient that is colonized progresses into infection with any organism. We think that the exposures that are determining this transition, this progression, have to do with antibiotics. And probably more than antibiotics, right? Acid gastric suppression, chemotherapy, surgeries, changes in diet, the stress of the hospitalization, etc. So I think that infection control is true. They decrease exposure so that patients that have altered microbiome don't get colonized, right? That's what we do in infection control. Antimicrobial stewardship decreases antibiotic exposures so that the microbiome does not get that disturbed. But in the future, I think that surveillance that we're going to do is survey for disruptions of the microbiome and correct that disruption manipulating the microbiome so that patients do not get colonized if exposed. Furthermore, what we can do is prevent that disruption from happening to begin with, right? There are patients that are going to need antibiotics, but how can we prevent that disruption even though the patients have antibiotics? That's the key, and that's the future from my perspective. Thank you very much.